So this too is a work in progress. It's a kind of update of a presentation I made online at NACIS 2 years ago. So if some of it seems familiar, I apologise. But given that COVID, I think, has addled everybody's brains, I thought it's probably a good time to bring it back to NACIS. Any comments warmly welcomed. I'm in the process of doing up a proposal to a book press. So, Cartotopia presents an atlas of maps created by artificial intelligence. A reckoning between carto and topos, cartography and place, this atlas is an exploration of how landscapes are mapped, how maps are read, and how computers might do both. Where some maps reflect utopias, dystopias, or heterotopias, places ideal, bad, or different, this is cycling, I'm not sure why. Okay. Rightio. Okay. So, where some maps might reflect utopias, dystopias, or heterotopias, places ideal, bad, or different, these maps simply reflect places mapped, cartotopias, places that only exist in the map, places made by machines. Generated from a cooperation of millions of pixels and probabilities, Cartotopia holds evidence of both cartographic and computational processes, in contradiction and collaboration, between mappers and machines, between metaphor and reason, between image and place. The maps in this atlas were produced using different suites of generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which learn, generate, style, and upsample, producing what might be better described as collective experiments in statistical probability than maps themselves. From a series of, in this case, 6 different cartographic styles, necessarily hegemonic, this atlas proposes places and landscapes that have never existed, a figment of the conversations hosted by artificial intelligence, a product of gradual machine learning and agreements between algorithms about what makes a map and how maps make places. Thus, Cartotopia is both a map and a territory, an image and a landscape, real and fake, singular and plural. Fraser writes that the digital can be generalised as a fractured form and a force for destructive but also rejuvenating change. Each map in this atlas skates across the uncanny. Strange familiarities saturate these cartographies that cannot be read, information that becomes less comprehensible the closer the eye gets. Like a blur in the iris, a word on the tip of the tongue, a face that slips from memory, a touch that is not quite made, a smell that has no source, Cartotopia leaves an unfulfilled promise, a question never answered. The landscapes depicted are illegible yet recognisable. What Fraser describes as the fragmentation of digital media in an era of late modernity, reaching into the disturbing tensions inherent in how maps are read, leveraging our ability to translate across the distance between the tools a cartographer uses to communicate and the heterogeneity of the spaces and places they purport to represent. What does this mean for cartography? From classification to representation, cartography has always been partial. Artificial intelligence, like the map, embeds the world in incomplete logics, the necessity of abstraction and generalization, the optimism of the coder or cartographer, the limitations of technology and the promises of the discourses which surround it. That we consider that artificial intelligence ought to reclassify, remeasure and redraw the world is perhaps more of a post-human error than a merely computational cartographical one. Built through both cartography and computation, Cartotopia is also partial. It traces the entanglements between data and discourse, between probability and power, in what Moore calls an algorithmic fabulation. To quote, "Just as computer science has become comfortable with experimental fabulation and narrative, it is necessary for others to play with the arrangements, thresholds, and assumptions of algorithms. A fabulatory method would take the arrangements, perceptions, and accounts of the algorithm and rework them to deepen the political intensity of what it means to output something into the world." End quote. Maps offer a very specific but useful starting point for such algorithmic fabulations because they already output something into the world in a very specific way. Maps comprise text, symbol, colour, line, stroke, weight, texture, patterns, image, and font. This vast palette of representational tools is central to how maps are able to communicate such complexity of meaning. Through maps, we can see how in artificial intelligence, generative adversarial networks in visual computing depend, infant-like, on the collection of images given to them, that the algorithmic fabulations of both engineers and artists alike starts at the source data. In this case, maps, made by a cartographer, a surveyor, a planner, or a settler. In this way, from cartographic origins, Cartotopia also calls for a critical reckoning of how we have come to conceptualize the human, the machine, and the post-human, as we've already come to understand the complex relationships between maps, mappers, and mapping. We referenced Del Casino and Hannah earlier. I think this is a good example. As Winter states, one cannot unsettle the coloniality of power without a redescription of the human outside the terms of our present descriptive statement of the human. Thus, Cartotopia approaches artificial intelligence and its own algorithmic fabulations from what Parisi describes as critical computation, a framework which argues for, quote, argues for the theorization of a sociality of reasoning within the computational strata. Specifically, this means being attuned to the way in which many of the contemporary debates on AI focus on the question of cognition without contextualizing the way in which reasoning, rationality, and specifically inference and inductive logic have historically been constructed. Geographers remind us that there are always referents. All knowledges are embedded in deep space, presaged, entangled, brought forth, and co-forming, to refer to Massey. The very conditions of possibility are spatial. As McKittrick states, the algorithms tell us what we already know, just in the future. And the future is built from the inequalities of the present. Within this monograph that I am writing, then, the approach to computation takes seriously Winter's argument that the concept of humanity arises from universalizing Western epistemes, specifically after the Enlightenment. And it also takes seriously King's elaboration on Western cartographic traditions' complicities, if not abetment, in the racial formations of settler colonialism, and the role that cartography and surveying has played in imperialism, to refer to Edney. Importantly, Cartotopia re-encounters visual computing in the context of the images that form its dataset to suggest that more images and bigger datasets do not solve the problem of bias. Our visual culture is already steeped in an unavoidable politics. For this reason, Cartotopia was generated as an experiment in trying to unpick how visual computation maps and makes, using cartography, a discipline itself, which itself maps and makes. I argue that Cartotopias might be understood as a form of what Watkins Fisher calls a tactic of parasitical resistance. Drawing from Michel Serres' work on post-parasite relations, parasitism is a mode of resistance from within systems or regimes of control through strategic complicity within the system itself. As a response to, quote, calls for politico-aesthetic strategies adequate to the waning sense of agency in a moment when political tools on hand appear co-opted in advance, parasitical resistance is ever more crucial when we find ourselves imbricated in representational systems, both cartographic and computational, that are increasingly homogeneous, monopolised and extractive. And so we can think here about the kind of emphasis on regression analysis, or regression particularly in generative AI. Further, as I've argued that the failures of cartography offer spaces of critical interrogation to the ongoingness of settler colonialism, Walker-Repberg argues that the failures of artificial intelligence are fertile grounds for the critical or qualitative researcher to try and understand how machine learning works and where its limitations lie. As Parisi reminds us, computation is not cognition. Thus, Cartotopia is also a story about limitations in size, in computing, in energy, and in inference into excess. Each Cartotopia is a fundamentally unique map, built from the dataset rather than merely copied. While Cartotopias build on the disciplines of cartography, its traditions and its standards, its complexities and its colonialisms, they are not reproductions as much as they are restructurings of knowledge power. Each map is a collection of maps. Each map is a map of a collection of maps. As the generative adversarial network turns image into a statistical activity, a series of probabilities derived from a model built computationally from the data it's given. In the transformation from cartography to code, the GAN takes the image of the cartographic coordinate grid and transforms it into a coordinated computational grid. Each line becomes a disjointed series of pixels, each colour a set of numbers, each image a series of layers transposed down and down again, shaped and reshaped. On graphic processing units in cloud computing, enormous amounts of energy are consumed to build these models, to analyse every shape, to complete every convolution. In a space of such excess, how much energy, human and environmental, can we justifiably place into such a fabulation? And at what point does parasitical resistance become complicit in the reproduction of power? How much do we need to know in order to know? These concerns mean that Cartotopia is also an exercise in restraint, in accepting limitations and accepting the partially formed. Thus, because of the limitations of working with cartographic collections, their size for one and the complexity of cartographic communication for another, The maps in this book are not really deep fakes, even though they use the same technologies. They're not voracious recreations of cartographic technique. I prefer to imagine them as shallow, in which the computational process is shaken up like sediment is sorted. And we can see the deep convolutions of the neural network are flattened into a critical legibility. In doing so, in many ways, we can see how maps were perhaps the first or the original deep fakes, where Crawford and Paglin argue that, quote, the automated interpretation of images is an inherently social and political project rather than a purely technical one. Carter contends, quote, and what is true of maps is true of geographical discourse in general. It is an idea of space that drives it, and not the willingness of the naive observer to take whatever she finds as it comes, end quote. So, rather than exploding the black box, and with an approach closer to sieving and winnowing, this cartotopic rumination results in a series of questions and partial answers, which leverage our training and desire to read the map, but disentangle and confound our smooth cognition between symbols and landscapes and question the very formulation of the map and machine learning themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Clancy. We have time for one quick question, if there's any. Yes.
Okay, so the question was about how do you deal with the question of accuracy in AI, and particularly AI mapping, which is quite distortive. And I mean, I would question whether or not accuracy is a useful guiding principle for anything AI, and particularly, anything mapping by and large as well. Maps were created in specific conditions to do specific things. And so trying to use a bathymetric map to scale a mountain is not going to work. You need to actually choose particular types of maps. But at the same time, people don't necessarily even need to use bathymetric maps to sail the ocean. There are all kinds of different knowledges, different modes of wayfinding that particularly like Polynesian navigators use. So I really question this kind of concern with accuracy as opposed to trying to reflect on our dependency on the map to constantly have to deliver information to us. Like we're kind of removing ourselves from the picture then. And so I think we should be focused, and this is why we sort of talk about this idea of the human. Where do we sit in this process as well? And I think this is why I kind of make the gentle argument that maps are kinds of deep fakes. Many of the maps of early settlements, my research is focused largely on Australia, were very accurate and terrible and deathly, because at the time that they were mapped, it was not a time of flood, it was not a time of fire, it was not a time of drought. And so there's always this kind of question of this accuracy. Can you create something that is spatially, temporally accurate for all times, all places, all possibilities? And I think that's not the case with mapping, let alone with artificial intelligence. Cool. Oh, that's my laptop.